Spy versus Spy. Written and performed by Eve Elliott. Nigel Spy cowered behind his front door, fingers poised on the handle, and risked a glance through the stained glass accent window. He needed to get out of the house. He didn't often feel the need to leave this twee little Yorkshire cottage he'd inherited from an aunt, but today he was just about chewing the carpet with boredom. He wasn't asking for much. All he wanted was half an hour to ramble down to the high street for some fags and a few cans, maybe an extra packet of crisps for the walk home, and to be left alone to enjoy them with his feet up in front of Top Gear. Was that so much to ask? If only that bloody woman would let him. Nigel's heart sank as he spotted the blurred shape through the wobbly coloured glass. There she was again, fussing with her gardenias, trimming, watering, cooing at the flowers like they were her pets. Her garden did not need daily tending. It always looked like something out of a magazine. In stark contrast to the overgrown jungle of his that had apparently swallowed a rusted-out Vauxhall Corsa. And yet there she was, every single day, barring his escape. He blew out a frustrated breath through his nose and stood back from the door, defeated. Mrs. Enid Spy, widow of a fourth cousin. In this town, everyone was some sort of relation if you went back a few generations, but still, he resented the slender connection. A squat, soft, doughy sort of person, with an enormous bosom that mushroomed out the sides of her white apron. Pink cheeks, wistful blue eyes, a nest of white curls piled up into a top knot, and silver wire glasses with the bottle-bottom lenses. She looked so much like Mrs. Claus that she portrayed her every year in the town's Santa's Grotto. She was sweet. Everyone said so. No children, no relations nearby to help her. Just a darling, talkative little old lady who tended her garden and toddled down to the post office once or twice a week with letters to her pen pals or her cousin overseas. Oh yes, she was sweet and lovely, and Nigel couldn't bloody stand her. It was the daily interruptions, the feeble little taps on his door, or even his kitchen window, the high, reedy little voice that always began, "Oh, my dear Mr. Spy, I'm ever so sorry to disturb you, but—" and the endless list of tasks and favours she'd ever so sweetly ask him to do. He'd killed earwigs for her. He'd shown her how to work her remote at least 100 times. He'd unscrewed uncooperative preserve jars and then had to suffer the disgustingly sweet stuff smeared on stale toast as thanks. He'd even smiled with the most sincerity he could bring himself to fake when she'd presented him with a mug that read "World's Best Neighbour," and then served him weak, sugary tea out of it every single day as they sat in her spotless kitchen and listened to classical music or The Archers on Radio 4. He couldn't leave the house without cringing at the creak of her front door opening and that fluting little warble, "Good morning, Mr. Spy," like they hadn't seen each other in years. She must plant herself by the door and wait for me to come out, he often thought, because he never made it past the half gate at the end of the garden without being assaulted by that cloying little voice. He'd only lived here a year, but it had been the worst year of his life by far. Nigel kicked aside the pile of leaflets and past due bills that was growing by the hour, it seemed, and tossed his keys on the hall table. The greasy smell from last night's lasagna still hung in the air, but he was rather getting used to it now, he ate it so often. 2 for 99p at Sainsbury's, 5 minutes in the micro. Robert's your mother's brother. That was another thing. The microwave bell was too loud. A month ago, Mrs. Spy had knocked on his door so timidly, her face full of genteel chagrin, and said ever so politely if he would mind awfully not using his microwave after 9 p.m, as the bell was so very loud, you see, and it disturbs Harold. Harold? Who the hell was Harold? Hope had soared in Nigel's heart that perhaps the old biddy had met a widower who could take over the bug-killing and stuck window opening for him. But like most aspects of Nigel's life, that faint hope had crashed again like a 10-car pile-up on the motorway. Harold was her cockatiel. And in short order, Nigel found out that, in terms of auditory disturbances, Harold gave as good as he got. Now that he thought of it, that bird had been the final straw. He'd been able to live with the daily tea breaks and the 6 a.m. requests to check the lead on her electric kettle or fetch a box of her husband's clothes from the cellar so she could put them out for the charity to collect. He could live with the gentle admonitions about the state of his garden, the peeling paint on his front door, or the grimy windows that really ought to be cleaned. He could tolerate the newspaper articles, helpfully clipped out with pinking shears, on losing weight after 40, or the dangers of smoking, or how X units of alcohol a day would rot your esophagus. He wasn't a terrible person, of course. He was willing to indulge a lonely old lady, to a degree. But when that goddamn bird showed up, he'd finally lost it. The first time the bird had shrieked, Nigel had shot out of bed, entangling himself in his bedsheets and crashing to the floor in a heap. Heart pounding, elbow throbbing from hitting the side table on the way down, he'd lain on the floor trying to catch his breath and wondering if he'd just dreamed that horrible, screeching wail. Then it happened again, and again, and spiralled into a crescendo of ear-splitting rancour that finally ended on one long, petulant scream. Harold. She'd decided to get a pet. And instead of adopting some scruffy little terrier or a mangy cat, she'd chosen perhaps the most offensive, irritating, sanity-withering animal on the face of the earth. Just as he was getting used to the daily serenade of avian outrage, 2 weeks ago Mrs. Spy had come to his door in tears, blubbering that dear Harold had escaped, and could he please help her find him? Good job, Harold, was Nigel's first thought. Maybe there is a God. But he'd agreed to look for the bird, hoping beyond hope that it had met its end with a neighbourhood cat or a kid with a well-aimed rock. He'd been exercising, Mrs. Spy had explained tearfully, blowing her nose into a hanky, flying around the house on unclipped wings, obviously desperate for a way out, Nigel thought grimly. He'd flown down to the cellar and discovered the broken window in the corner. Another thing Nigel hadn't gotten round to fixing yet. Harold had hopped through the bars and fled, and Nigel had spent hours upon hours roaming the neighbourhood with a pillowcase, shouting out, "Harold, here, pretty bird," to the amusement of passers-by. He'd worn his feet to bloody stumps searching for that bird, who, it turned out, had been sitting primly on Mrs. Spy's roof the whole time, staring at him. He'd spent another 2 hours trying to coax, cajole, threaten and bribe the thing down until Harold had finally grown tired, flown to his shoulder, puffed up his impressive white crown of feathers, and screamed. "What have I done, Lord?" Nigel asked this question often, to a deity he didn't believe existed. "What sin have I committed to deserve this neighbour from hell?" Nigel flopped down onto his sofa and howled as a lasagna-crusted fork lodged itself in his kidney. He tilted his hips up and dug out the offending item and tossed it onto the floor with the rest of the dirty dishes. He settled back down and closed his eyes, trying to take a deep breath like his therapist had taught him to do. Deep breath in through the mouth, hold it for a few seconds, let it out through the nose. Or maybe it was in through the nose and out through the mouth. He tried it again, both ways. It didn't help. He felt like he always did, stressed out, miserable, and wishing Aunt Verity had never left him this house. Well, that wasn't entirely true. He was grateful for the house, considering he'd never managed to keep a job for very long and didn't really care to anyway. He'd stocked shelves at Boots for a time, but that snooty manageress who wore too much makeup and always looked at him like she just smelled something rancid had told him not to bother coming back. He was off-putting to the customers, she said, in his tatty black T-shirts that didn't quite cover the overhang of his belly and his grungy black trainers with the holes in the toe. What did he care? It was a rubbish job anyway. Verity's house was paid for, and all his. And with his disability allowance, he didn't have to worry about the stress of earning a living, which his therapist agreed he just couldn't do, not with his level of anxiety. And it would be nice here, really, even if he couldn't rouse himself to clean the place and didn't really give a toss about the garden. It was comfortable and warm, and they gave him a discount on the TV licence because of his anxiety, and it was only a short walk down to the high street and the off-track betting and the kebab place. It would be okay to live here, if only he could get rid of the old cow next door. He'd thought about it often enough. In the bath, whilst her television blared through the wall.
"I'm ever so sorry, Mr. Spy, but my hearing is not what it was, and I do enjoy my Coronation Street."
Or when trying to take a nap as she banged out "Oh, Promise Me" on her out-of-tune upright, or when that bloody bird started screaming. How much easier it would be if she would just drop dead. How much quieter, simpler and easier on his nerves life would be if only she were gone. They were just fantasies, he told himself, as he envisioned all the ways he could do it and get away with it. He could take the spare key she'd foisted on him.
"In case of an emergency, my dear Mr. Spy."
Sneak into her room one night and smother her with a pillow. It would look like she'd passed away in her sleep, wouldn't it? No, she'd probably struggle, and he might not have the nerve to finish her off. Maybe during one of their tea breaks he could surreptitiously put the gas on? No, the rotten egg smell would give it away. A toaster dropped into her bath? Damn, these houses had circuit breakers now, just to prevent that sort of thing. He closed his eyes and thought up fiendish ways of bumping her off, like in the detective fiction he liked to read. He imagined himself as a cunning assassin, sliding a stiletto between her ribs and guiding her lifeless body to the kitchen lino, or silencing a pistol with a potato and splattering her brains and potato peels all over her antiseptic kitchen. He could never actually do any of this, of course, but it made him feel better just thinking about it. If only she'd suffer a fall, like so many people her age did. There were 2 flights of stairs in her house, the one with the lurid red carpet leading up to the 2nd floor, and the creaky wooden one leading down to the cellar off the kitchen. Why couldn't she just take a tumble one day? That's when the idea came to him. It was simple and easy to do, and best of all, he wouldn't even need to be there. If he took a length of fishing line and stretched it across the bottom of the cellar doorway, say 3 inches off the floor, she'd trip on it the next time she went down to fetch those god-awful preserves. He could listen for it even, imagining the unholy racket her body would make tumbling down to the cement floor. Then he could simply remove the wire, and after a day or 2 ring the police for a welfare check, concerned as he was for his dear old neighbour. Nigel sat up slowly. His heart started to pound with the possibilities. A fall like that might not kill her, but that was all right. Even if she just broke a hip or something, she'd have to go to hospital for an extended period. She might even need to move to a care home and sell her house. She might even need to sell her house. The next time she went out to mail her letters, he decided he'd let himself in and arrange it. Breathless with anticipation, giddy at the thought of freedom from Mrs. Spy forever, he clicked on the television and was finally able to relax. Enid Spy closed and latched her front door. She allowed herself a moment, only a moment, to rest her back against it and close her eyes. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Nigel Spy had refused to come out. She'd seen his shadow passing behind the decorative stained glass window of his front door, a lurking, cowering shadow, if she wasn't being too fanciful. He was hiding from her, a little old woman out in her garden. She'd fussed with her gardenias and the morning glories as long as she could before finally giving up on him and coming in. Oh well, onward and upward. She pushed off from the door and moved purposefully into the lounge, surveying the room with a practised eye. Carpet hoovered yesterday. the lines made by the machine still visible. Hummel figurines dusted the day before, their glass cabinet gone over with the spray, throw pillows plumped and artfully arranged, sofa and matching settee hoovered as well, sadly no lines to show it had been done. Lovely, just as everything ought to be. In the kitchen she flipped on the electric kettle and was about to reach for the china cup she preferred when she spotted a blob of something on the base of the kettle. She whipped off a single sheet from the roll of kitchen towel next to the kettle and scrubbed at the blob with vigour until it vanished, leaving the base gleaming and clean. As it should be. Overall, she was pleased. The pale gardenias in the window filled the room with a fresh, delicate scent, and the white cupboard doors gleamed, thanks to last Saturday's day of scrubbing and shining. The floor had been newly waxed, and the windows sparkled in the sunshine. Yes, she was pleased. Clean, efficient, and with just that slight touch of elegance that revealed her to be a woman of taste and excellent breeding. She took her tea to the small table near the window and sat, gazing out onto her beloved garden, another source of considerable pride. Surely the Lord wouldn't consider it a sin, she mused, to be proud of one's industry and devotion to order and beauty, especially when she spent such effort trying to raise the standards of everything around her, like that beastly man next door. Her eyes darted over to his garden, and a shudder went through her at the sight of it. Wild grass and weeds at least waist high, a disused fire pit and a mouldering blue bag of lager cans, but worse still, the mortal remains of some kind of economy car. A car! In the front garden! It was monstrous that the council refused to act, despite her many calls and letters. In her day, it would have been hauled out of there immediately, and the owner presented with a hefty bill and a stern look. These days, the council were as lazy as her neighbour was. When Verity Hobbs had owned the place next door, a hard woman in her late 50s, very ropey and lean, who had dressed like a teenager and entertained much younger men, she'd claimed not to know who'd put the vehicle there, that it had been there when she'd inherited the house in 1997. Gracious, imagine not caring about a thing like that or doing anything about it for nearly 25 years. Enid had hoped the new owner, described to her as a bachelor in his 40s, would be just the sort of gentleman the neighbourhood needed, someone who would clean up the place and make an attempt to rise to the standard of the other houses on the street. Oh, how wrong she'd been. She sipped her tea and put her cup down delicately, enjoying the genteel sound of a fine china cup settling on a fine china saucer. The more she thought of Mr. Spye, the more precise and elegant her movements became, as if in counterpoint to the utter horror of the man. She'd watched through the net curtain with great anticipation as the removal company van had pulled up, almost this time last year. Expecting a dapper, neat sort of fellow approaching his middle years, she'd been shocked by what had actually emerged from the passenger side of the van. Huge, stoop-shouldered, carrying at least 7 or 8 stone more than he should, with shoulder-length, stringy black hair that fell across his eyes and had to be flicked away whenever he wanted to look at anything. And the clothes! From that first day onward, she'd only ever seen him in black. Not crisp black, however, which could be elegant and hide a host of sins, but the too many times through the wash black, all faded and dull. He didn't work, she'd found out quickly enough. He didn't do much of anything except play his television too loud and smoke. She'd peek through the curtains and see him trudging up the road with a bag of cans from the off-licence, inhaling package after package of crisps, oblivious to the spectacle of slovenliness he was. She'd ring Louisa, her friend across the street, and gossip about him. And on her way into the post office, she'd stop to commiserate with the lovely young mother, married, thank heaven, who'd just moved in at number 77. But all the furtive complaints in the world wouldn't change the man. And so she'd had to think of something else. Because he had to go. He simply had to go. He was bringing down the whole neighbourhood and preventing her beautiful house and garden from shining. Instead of winning the Tidy Streets competition or the Garden of the Year prize, the best she could hope for now was that people didn't actually stop and stare at his place or point and laugh. So there was really nothing for it. He simply had to go. She'd read in the Dear Hortense column of Ladies' Weekly about a man who was so worn down by his neighbours' constant requests for favours and errands that he'd ended up moving away. This was a splendid idea, she'd thought. She'd simply make such a nuisance of herself that he'd sell the property and take his squalor somewhere else. At first she'd taken pains to be sweet and doddering, so as to tug on his conscience and make him feel too guilty to say no. That had worked a treat, and soon she was accosting him every day, usually for some minor irritation, like a stubborn lid or an earwig that needed to be dispatched. Some days she was the one offering help, in the form of criticism about his weight, his clothes, anything she could think of. Most days she made him sit with her and listen to the radio. She'd even bought him a tacky mug emblazoned with the slogan, "World's Best Neighbour," just to lay the guilt on even thicker. But as the year wore on and he made no signs of moving, or heaven help her, cleaning up, she knew she'd have to up the stakes. She'd gone to the RSPCA and lied about going deaf, asking if they had any loud birds in need of rescue. Sure enough, Harold was just such a creature, and she'd been delighted the first time he let loose one of his unearthly screams. She hated Harold, there were no two ways about it. Birds were horrendous house pets and entirely too dirty for her spotless house and white furniture, but if he helped get rid of the slug next door, his limited time with her would be well worth it. Trouble was, she mused, glancing again at the rusted garden gate next door, even Harold wasn't doing the trick. She wasn't the sort to let melancholy take hold of her. She was of the generation that didn't put stock in any of that depression rubbish. When she felt her spirits sinking, she rallied and regrouped, which is what she knew she had to do now. As loath as she was to take such a drastic step, there really was nothing for it. If he wouldn't move, well, then she'd have to find another way to get him out of there. She went to the cupboard under the sink and retrieved the insecticide she'd had Nigel use on the earwig. It was amazing they even sold this concoction, she marvelled, looking at the imposing yellow skull and crossbones glaring at her from the front of the box. It contained cyanide, for pity's sake. Cyanide! It was useful, no question, and the strong odour and taste could be easily disguised in sweet tea or preserves, but how irresponsible of the government to allow just anyone to buy such a thing. At least she had only used it when absolutely necessary, and at that only twice before. When her husband had grown too feeble to care for himself and had made such a ghastly mess, and then again with that marijuana-smoking tramp, Verity Hobbs. Because really, one simply couldn't be expected to put up with such things. She picked up the telephone and dialed Nigel's number, all the while mixing a spoonful of the insecticide into his World's Best Neighbour mug.
"Oh, good afternoon, Mr. Spy. I'm about to walk down to the post office, but I could bring back a gâteau from the bakery if you'd like to join me for tea when I return."
An hour later, Enid Spy and Nigel Spy sat across from each other at her kitchen table. The sun was glorious, streaming in through her sparkling window and reflecting cheerfully off the cut glass vase of flowers. Classical music tinkled lightly from the radio.
"Not long now," thought Enid.
Not long now, thought Nigel. They smiled at each other as the kettle began to boil.
"What a charming day,"
Enid sang, rising from the table to make tea. She poured the water into a polished silver teapot and readied 2 cups, the delicate white china cup and saucer for her, and the World's Best Neighbour mug for him. She fussed with the milk and sugar, careful to add an extra 2 lumps to the powdery bottom of his mug.
"It was such a delightful walk. I do so love this time of year. Such beauty everywhere."
"It's a bit too hot," Nigel replied. "Could do with a bit of rain." He glanced over at the open door to the cellar. He knew he shouldn't keep looking at it. He didn't want to call attention to it, but the desire to keep confirming that the wire couldn't be seen was almost overpowering. He'd rushed the job, knocking 2 small nails into the door frame and winding each end of the wire around them until it was stretched taut, watching the clock the whole time. He needn't have hurried. She'd taken almost an hour to return from shopping. But it was done now, and even in the bright sunlight he could barely make out a slight glint of light in the doorway, and only because he knew to look for it. Now he just had to make an excuse and get back home, because it would look very bad for him if he were here when it happened.
"There we are, Mr. Spy,"
Enid said brightly, placing a tray with 2 cups and 2 slabs of chocolate cake on the table between them. She took a seat opposite him and politely offered him his mug before taking her own from the tray.
"Don't respond to the comment about the heat," she warned herself. "Don't tell him he wouldn't be so uncomfortable if he didn't insist on wearing head-to-toe black every day. Just encourage him to drink his tea."
But he didn't. He just sat there, nibbling on his thumbnail. "I'm sorry, but I can't stay today, Mrs. Spy," he said at length. "I completely forgot. I have an appointment with my therapist."
"Surely you can spare the time for some of this lovely gateau,"
Enid said, pushing a plate with the largest wedge of cake towards him.
"I bought it especially for you."
He glanced at the cake. "That was very kind of you. Maybe tomorrow." Enid pursed her lips.
"Tomorrow I have a meeting with the Tidy Streets Committee."
She softened her tone and smiled.
"At least finish your tea, please."
They locked eyes with each other, and inside each of them a heart began to pound. Like gunfighters facing each other in some Dust Bowl frontier town, hands twitching above their holsters, eyes keen and wary, the 2 adversaries waited, barely breathing, for one or the other to make a move. Nigel decided to move first. But just as he rose from the table, a flapping, screeching white blur swooped into the kitchen, buzzed the table, and narrowly avoided crashing into him as it angled left and careened off the fridge freezer. "Harold!" they both cried. Nigel reached for the bird, almost caught a tail feather, and waved his arms to swat it back into the lounge. Enid rose and tossed him a tea towel, and he flung that at the bird with the same futility. He'd almost herded it back through the kitchen door when it changed direction and, with the steely purpose in its beady eyes, tucked in its wings and, bullet-like, made for the cellar. Jesus, not the cellar, Nigel thought desperately. And without another thought beyond stopping Harold from escaping again, he too went through the cellar door. The yelp of surprise and alarm as his ankle met with the fishing wire was surpassed in volume only by the tumult of his body crashing down the cellar stairs, his arms and legs bashing against the walls, his head smacking against each wooden step on the way down. When he came to rest, upside down and tangled on the cement floor at the base of the stairs, his neck was cocked to the side at a wholly unnatural angle. The eyes that stared up at Harold, coolly observing him from his perch on the banister, were glassy and still. Enid rushed to the doorway and stared down at the pretzeled pile of man below. Her hand flew to her mouth and she began to pick her way down the steps, not noticing the snapped fishing wire that now lay, invisible and harmless, across the top stair. As she drew closer to the body, she grimaced at the impossible contortion of his neck, and how his belly was now completely exposed beneath his torn shirt.
"Mr. Spy?"
she called, although she suspected he could no longer hear her. Best to make sure, though.
"Mr. Spy, can you hear me?"
She stepped over him gingerly and bent down to press 2 fingers to his neck. Satisfied, she straightened and regarded the body. Perhaps she ought to try to rearrange him a little, for when the police arrived. He did look ever so undignified. She made an effort to tuck his arms in and tried to shift his bulk so that he wasn't quite so piled up against the wall, but he really was an enormous man, and soon she realized the task was beyond her strength. She resigned herself to leaving him as he was and made her way upstairs. She paused to stroke Harold and thank him, resolving to sprinkle the insecticide into his food only after the police had left. With each step upwards, her jubilation grew. What a marvellous turn of events! She could not have hoped for a happier accident. Clearly, she was entirely blameless for the tragedy, as the police would see, and best of all, she was finally rid of the odious Mr. Spy. Sweating from her efforts, she plopped down at the table to catch her breath. The day was unseasonably warm, and so she absently reached for a cup of tea to quench her parched throat, and took a healthy gulp. As the sickly sweet liquid passed her lips, she looked down and froze. The world's best neighbour mug fell from her hands, making an awful mess.